And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have two newcomers into the temple. They are the double-headed monster that is the development team of the Altered World experience. In the blue corner we have Seth Schrum, and in the red corner we have Travis Hauser. How you doing today, man?
Good.
Hey, Mildred.
Thanks
Thanks
for
for
having
having us on.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. So, bit of a tradition around here is opening with the humble beginnings, in a sense. So, walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
You want to go first, Seth?
Sure. Yeah, so for me, 7th grade, and that was a lot of years ago, because I looked in the mirror this morning and realized I got old. But yeah, several decades ago when I was but a wee lad, one of my schoolmates asked if I wanted to play this kind of role-playing game experience. It was an off-brand, knockoff, homebrew D&D kind of concept, and I was hooked. Exploring dungeons, getting loot, killing monsters, all the good stuff. That's where it began for me.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it started a little bit earlier than that. I think I was probably around 10, maybe 11. I got my hands on one of the supplements for the. I always bought the supplement first before the game. I bought one of the supplements for the old Iron Crown Enterprises first edition Middle Earth role playing.
Oh yeah,
and because it was, I think it was the adventure of the Mines of Moria.
Mm-hmm.
And so because it had to do with the Lord of the Rings, I could get around my mother's worries about the satanic panic back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a friend that I played D&D with on the sly when I would go stay the night at his house, and then found myself in the 7th grade in the same group with Seth. And that's kind of where our friendship started as well. And again, like, I was hooked. I thought it was cool. Part of it was that I wasn't really officially allowed to do it, and so that was how I was going to be rebellious. But no, it was lots of fun, and then just kind of never wanted to quit. I personally had about a 17-year hiatus, unfortunately, right after the 3.5 transition,
Mm-hmm.
and skipped completely over 4th edition, which I think is for the best, from what I hear from everybody. And then only within the last year have got back into gaming actively, but it's always been something that really was a big part of my life. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Now, when it comes to the Altered World experience, was this something where you ended up house ruling your way into making this particular game? Was it a case of building upon the previous foundation? How did the project come about?
Well, so
that's a great question. It's really friends of ours that we linked up with when we were in college. A gentleman named Mike Hill had begun writing this thing. I think he said in the late 80s is when
Right.
he first started writing the beginnings of what would become Altered World. And we're just carrying the torch. They passed it on to us. Mike and a couple of our other friends, John Moore and JP McCauley, really did a lot to develop this game, and they got it almost to the finish line back when we were all in college. It didn't happen. That's the way life is sometimes. And now here it is, 25 years later, and through happenstance, we've decided that we are willing and able to pick this thing up and see if we can get it across the finish line, because as players of the game and play testers and being on the periphery of the development back in the day, we love this game. You know, we really believe in it. It is a really fun game to play. Anybody that we've played with has always enjoyed it and said that they think it's superior to other things they've played. We want to bring that experience and that opportunity to as many people as we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we probably met Mike and John through JP, who was a year or so ahead of us in high school, and then I ended up actually moving in and being Mike, the main writer's roommate. And so for kind of the last year of development, I was living, even though he was the one typing at the keyboard, I was in the conversation every single night, plowing away with the rules and trying to figure out the right balance of realism and playability and all of that. And so, you know, like Seth said, like, it just didn't happen. It was a very different world. You know, they were, you know, they had plans to kind of storm Gen Con and try and get things done. That was in '98, and you know, you think about, there was no such thing as Kickstarter. The crowdfunding was nowhere near anything, and so they were like, "Hey, we've got to come up with," you know, they had done the studies and found that at the average game that came out without a completed supplement at that time, if you didn't have at least one supplement already ready to go at the time you brought the game to market, you had a 90% chance of failure. And so they were starting to work on the idea of a supplement, and really, you know, the printing at that time was much more expensive. Everything had to be physical copies. There was no digital copy that you could way to sell people. And so they were looking at, you know, they needed somewhere around $25,000-$30,000 in 2000, you know, 1998, 2000 money to get a print run done. And so what ultimately ended up happening is they shifted focus a little bit from the game to try and generate some revenue. And then when that happened, that, you know, it lost a little bit of momentum. And then we picked it back up because I have one of, I think, 2, maybe 3 existing physical printouts from the last version of the game that was for final proofreading. And it's just been sitting in a binder for 25 years. Seth and I were reconnecting after he had been, we were both in the service, and then he did some other work, and so we kind of separated, came back over our whole life. And so we were getting back in touch and just having a conversation about, oh man, we missed that game. And he said something, I was like, well, I got a physical copy of it right here. I've always wanted to do something with it.
Mike had lost the game. He had everything on the soft copy. Again, you gotta remember, this was a couple of decades ago, so things were not backed up on the cloud. And he had a hard drive that got corrupted, and that's where this thing was stored. So when we were talking about this and how much we loved Altered World, you know, I had talked to Mike at one point within the last few years, and he told me that the game didn't exist anymore. I tried to actually get it from him so I could bring it to some friends and we could all play together. And he's like, "I'm sorry, man. The data got corrupted. It's all gone." And so when Travis and I were talking on the phone, you know, he was saying that he really liked it, and I was like, "Well, you know, the game is gone." Travis was like, "What are you talking about? I got a PDF. I got a physical copy right here on my desk." Like, does Mike know that? I said, "I don't have his number." I said, "Well, here, man, would you like his number? We can make this happen."
Yeah, and so from there, it started to go into conversations of us getting official licensing permission from them, which actually, like, we got a verbal go ahead from all 3 of them, Mike, John, and JP. Mike was the principal author, John was the principal editor, and JP did virtually all, if not all, of the illustrations that are in the book. And so we got verbal confirmation from them that they were fine with us proceeding forward. And then very recently we got like official, like we became officially official with a full-blown legally binding license agreement so that we have exclusive rights to license and market the IP, and the ability to produce new content in the same IP realm. So, and so we're excited about the opportunity, to bring this game out, because as Seth said earlier, like basically every single person who ever played this game, and bear in mind it is pre 3.5 or pre 3.0 D&D, so it's a different world that they were coming from in terms of games and what they were trying to do. But everybody who came to that game never wanted to play anything else from that point forward. That's all they wanted to play. And there's a number of reasons, I think, why that was something they wanted to do. But it was a really, really loved game by that group, and we hope that we'll be able to bring that and share that with other people and allow them to experience the same things that we got to experience, because it's got some really cool elements that some stuff is still, as far as I know, still nobody's done it, and then there's some other stuff that I think there's one or two other systems that have done similar concepts. So given that it's 25 years old is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, you guys are no doubt familiar with the concept of Appendix N. So, when it comes to the Altered World experience, what would you say would be some of the other media, whether it be games, film, comic books, video games, that would be within its Appendix N?
So you're talking, actually, I don't know that I've ever heard the phrase Appendix N, but you're talking about just influences.
Yeah, in like White Wolf games, this is the further reading kind of section.
Okay.
That you see in the front end of the book. Appendix N is just used as a catch-all for this kind of thing.
Sure. So I think so if you started from what other games were out there that influenced its development, it very much was influenced by Shadowrun. It very much was influenced by GURPS and the Palladium games, both Palladium and Rifts. It was, I think, I don't want to say negatively influenced, but it was kind of a reactionary influence from D&D Second Edition. Because there's elements of the game that were very much like, let's move away from the way that this is done. As far as like films and movies and stuff, as far as like film influences, we had Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead, Reservoir Dogs, Neuromancer, Neuromancer the book. They were very heavily into William Gibson, so Neuromancer, Burning Chrome, Virtual Light, Heavy Weather, all of those books that he did strongly influenced other films. I mean, the group had a very eclectic film influence, ranging from things like Akira Kurosawa's Dreams to Uratsugi Doji to Lone Wolf and Cub to all of those.
Let's not forget Blade Runner. Let's not forget Neil Stephenson. Diamond Days. And,
for sure. And Snow Crash.
Snow Crash. Yeah. That was a big one.
Snow Crash is a huge influence. And then there's a little plug, if anybody kind of along this same line, anybody who's got Spotify, there is an Altered World Experience playlist that is the music that we kept all of our neighbors up with while we were writing the game. And I've put together what I could, and then and Mike Hill is actually adding to it, but it's things like the Sisters of Mercy, Dead Can Dance, Sepultura to some degree, Man or Astro Man, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I'm trying to think. There's Skinny Puppy, Orb. The list is huge. And so, there's a big Appendix N of influences here.
Mhm. Now, since you mentioned stuff like Shadowrun and GURPS, this is as good of a segue as any to get into what I've referred to as the Rome effect.
Okay.
All roads lead to Rome, because I don't
Sure.
know when this happened, but at some point the idea of a bunch of collected subsystems gave way to a unified resolution for the most part. Uh,
Mhm.
So, with that in mind, when it comes to the core resolution of Altered World, is it a case of it being a d6 pool, it being a sum of dice? Is it aim high, aim low? Where does the core
Well,
roam go?
mechanically 2d10 will get you there. Sometimes you'll roll 2, sometimes you'll roll 1. Sometimes you want to roll high, sometimes you want to roll low. I'm afraid that might make it sound more complicated than it really is, but there's a little bit of math. It can get a little crunchy for those who like that. And sometimes it's just, for low target rolls or high target rolls where you're just rolling a 1d10, determines whether you want to be over or under a particular number.
Yeah, there's basically there's you can divide it into 2d10 rolls versus 1d10 rolls. And there's essentially, I think it's 3. There may be 4 on one of them, but there's a couple of different variations of these two mechanics, right? So on the 1d10 roll side, there's basically 3 ways that works. You either have a high target number where you are trying to exceed the target number on 1d10. And then you have a low target number or a low target roll, which is you're trying to match or get below whatever the target number is. And so the distinction there really becomes, if you're rolling in a target number of 5 with a high target roll, you have to roll 6 or higher. With a low target roll, it's 5 or lower. And so that target number is a success on a low target roll. The only other, there's 2 other 1d10 rolls. One is response, which we use in our combat system, which is where you roll 1d10 and add your initiative attribute. And then the other one is the other one is perception, which is a low target roll against your perception attribute. On the 2d10 side, the core mechanic is what we call an action roll. And there's a couple different variations of what kind of, you have a power action roll or a talent action roll. Those are fundamentally the same thing. But everything in the system is rating based, and so everything's quantified. And so if you're making an attack, an attack roll is a action roll with your, armed combat talent.
Mm-hmm.
And so you take your talent rating plus the related attribute. In this case, it would be the combat secondary attribute. And then you roll your 2d10, and you are trying to achieve a total of 20. We use a fixed DC for determining success at the action. There are some cases where you'll have a floating DC based on actions that are not necessarily appropriate to resolve with just a single roll. And that gets into one of the other types of the 2d10 rolls. If you have an action roll, there's what's called a competition roll, which is basically an action roll where two opposing forces make the same roll, and you do the little math to figure out who succeeded more at their task. And then the third one is what we call, and this is one of the things that we've kind of codified. It existed before, but we gave it a name. It's called an accumulation roll, and that's for things like if I'm trying to hack into a computer system, it may not necessarily be appropriate to just resolve that with a single roll. And so it would be a series of rolls where you're trying to accumulate a certain amount of success over time to determine how long that event occurs or how long that takes, and beating whatever the defense rating of the system is.
Yeah, I can.
But that's really where it goes.
I'm guessing that you guys plan on having a bit of like a one-page cheat sheet to quickly reference this kind of thing, so that players can know which role is which for what they're going to be using.
Yeah, for sure, and that's part of our kind of our planned release, right? So we have, we were hoping to be able to hit it by next month. I'm not sure that that's actually going to happen, but we're going to do what we call the Beer and Pretzels kit, which is a series of, a selection of pre-generated characters, a basic adventure, and like you said, these cheat sheets, one for the game master and a couple for the players, so that it's a crib sheet and it's got all the mechanics from, when you talk about combat and mechanics, it's 20, 30 pages in the book. Condense all that down to just tabular format, so it's easy to reference. And then and so those will be there. But by and large, it really doesn't. It's not as complicated as it might sound, right? It really does become, one of the things that a fixed DC allows us to do is you do a big chunk of the math before you ever roll the dice. And so we operate off of what's called an action roll base. So in that example of making an attack using your armed combat talent, you would do the math ahead of time and say, okay, if 20 is a success or a hit, I'm going to take 20 and subtract my armed combat rating and my combat attribute from 20, and that tells me I need to roll a 7 in order to achieve success. And so then it's really just a matter of you roll 2d10 and look at what your ARB is, and then there's a little bit of math on the back end of like how much more did I exceed that, because those what we call success levels can be used in different ways to affect the outcome of the roll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, when I looked at the character creation setup,
yeah,
one of the things that I definitely noticed is it's, unless I'm mistaken, it seems like you guys are going for a bit of a life path system when it comes to the question and answer setup that you've got.
Honestly, I'm not familiar with the life path system, but that is, so we actually have two different ways of character creation. So the one that you're referencing is what we call character modeling. And that was designed specifically for players who are familiar with role-playing games, but are not familiar with Altered World. And what the whole intent of that is that, most systems, not all, but many systems, you want to make a character, you got to take the player's handbook, read through all the options for classes, read through all the options for races, and figure out what you want to be and put it all together.
Mm-hmm.
And the intent of this was you don't even need the book. You have a character sheet, a character modeling sheet, and a couple of other pieces of paper, 2 or 3 pieces of paper that you print out, and you sit down and you have a conversation with the game master. And the game master asks you this series of questions algorithmically, and your answers, based on what you think sounds cool, drives you towards a selection of a species and what we call a naosh, which is an in-game language word. That is the closest we have to a true class. And then once that's done, then you kind of divide out how your points are. It also helps you arrive at what emphasis your character faces, whether it's talents or powers or wealth or anything like that. And then you build the character mechanically. And then you have the option to go in and just read the sections of the book that are relevant to your character, so you can understand if you end up with an orc ninshane as your species and naosh combination, you can just go straight to orc and straight to ninshane and find out what that means, and get an idea of it without having to read 200 pages of a 300-page manual.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a system that, at least at the time, was completely novel. It sounds like there are some other systems that have done something similar, but I don't know how far they've taken it down, like you don't need the book at all to make your character. And then the second method is full creation. And that's basically you start with a certain number of points and you build the character you want. and you're just kind of tossed in the middle of the Atlantic, and you can literally do whatever you want. What we find is the way I describe it is that character modeling is moving from using the rule of cool to arrive at the mechanical build of your character, and then determining who that character is.
Yeah.
With full creation, you essentially have to start from a hook, at least a hook. And it could be like, I want one power that does this thing or whatever, but you have to have some nugget to build your character around. Otherwise, it's very easy to get lost and get a character that's disjointed and doesn't really have a good persona.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. And one of the tricky things that comes out of this is you're doing character creation that is very point based, and while a lot of people will romanticize the point based affair, as with everything, it's a double edged sword, and
Sure.
there's a lot of freedom that you can have with it, but it also has a bit of a higher floor because of the fact that there's just going to be a lot of, for lack of a better word, traps or people having analysis paralysis. And would it be fair to say that the more Q&A style of character creation as an option is your guys' way of addressing that?
Seth,
Yeah,
you
it
want to take that?
definitely speeds things along. Yeah. Again, for people who aren't so familiar with the system, this gets you into the game, right? And you start seeing what the possibilities are. As you do that, and you interact with other players who've built their characters. You play in the game master's world, bounce off a few NPCs, and just get familiar with the system itself. You start having ideas for, oh, hey, this would be cool. This is another way, and that can funnel you down into full character creation, right? But as far as a point-based system, yeah, it's nice. It is a double-edged sword. I think you're right that you can't have everything. You can build the character you want. You just might not have everything all the way that you want, right? There is a way for the character to progress over the course of a game or a campaign. There's ways to level those things up. So it also it helps you have a goal and something to shoot for, But if you really, really want to be one of the world's best swordsmen, for example, most characters start with what we call 15 character creation points, and people with characters with 15 CCPs, character creation points, they're a cut above, right? Like they're more than just the normal folks. They are the heroes, and so they're going to have enough points to put themselves to where they can be world class in one, maybe even two things. Can they get better? Absolutely. If they want to be pretty good at 3 or 4 things, they can do that. It just depends on how you want to focus your points. Do you want to spread them out, or do you want to pile them up in one thing? But you've got things you have to purchase with your points, right? You've got to get your attributes. You've got to get talents. If you choose to have powers, supernatural powers, magic powers, you can pay to have access to those and purchase those. And then, interestingly, in our game, level is handled a little differently than I've seen it in most other games, where you can start at level 0 or you can start at level 10. You buy level with points, and the mechanic behind level, among other things, it dictates how effective you can be at certain things. So as you increase your character or improve your character through gameplay, you may or may not decide to level up. But if you purchase extra level, it doesn't necessarily adjust a whole lot of other things on your character sheet. You have to adjust things individually as you go.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. And since you mentioned Shadowrun earlier, and you mentioned and since this is meant to be a science fiction fantasy hybrid in that regard,
yeah,
this is where I have to bring up one of the elephants in the room, as it were, and that is the handling of hacking. This is
Yeah.
one of those things that a lot of people have tried, and how many of them have been successful is up in the air. A lot of times due to the hacking system being this elaborate affair that turns a section of that gameplay session into a duet. I mean, yeah, you can have multiple hackers, but let's be honest, that's not how people compose parties. It's just not part of human nature. So when it comes to that sort of thing, when it comes to the hacking question, is that something that you guys tackle? Is it a case where it has or hasn't have a system around it? How do you guys do it?
So hacking in our game is definitely not the same way that it's handled in Shadowrun. It's probably not the same way that it's handled in like House of Eidolons, where part of it, interestingly enough, is while we are a science fiction and fantasy hybrid game, there are elements that are common to cyberpunk. Altered World is not explicitly cyberpunk, and part of the reason why I think it's not is that hacking is a thing you can do, but it's not such a huge focus on it. And I think that is, for me at least, is one of the defining elements of true cyberpunk. And so we added hacking in as part of the computer's talent, right? And the way that our talent structure works is you have a talent, and then there's sub skills and things you can do what's called a mastery in, where it's you increase your depth but reduce your breadth within the talent structure. And so hacking is something you can take a sub skill in, you can take a mastery into it, so that you can be better at it. But essentially, for our perspective, we never felt it was worthwhile to go in and do the very cinematic metaverse type method of doing computers, right? Our thought is that one, it's the technological level that we're looking at in the game is significantly farther afield than most games are written. The game is essentially set in 28th century Earth technology with the addition of alien technology over the course of time. And on top of that, Mike, the lead author, was an actual computer programmer and is an actual computer programmer. And so for him, he never really liked the way it was treated. And so functionally, hacking really kind of comes down in the game to, if you need to hack into something, it's a couple of dice rolls. We manage it as an accumulation roll that is against whatever the defense rating of the computer system that you're trying to get into. And so it's you make an attempt, and it may take you a couple rolls, and then you do a little bit and you figure out how long it took you, and then it's just something that happens within the overall narrative, right? So to make that element critical to the game, rather than going down the path of really emphasizing what's happening in the computer program, it's more about, okay, let's figure out how long this takes you to do, and then figure out what's going on narratively around how long that takes.
Think about it like this. In Dungeons and Dragons, does the game stop if the rogue needs to pick a lock? Like, yeah, it's one rogue who's doing it, and it's his time to shine. But that's something that can be handled with a few dice rolls. And there can be other things going on around it, right? Same in Altered World. Somebody might need to be hacking into something, but if that's happening in combat, maybe they're completely occupied with that, and so the dungeon master and that player have their interaction, but it doesn't have to isolate the rest of the players at the table if there's other things going on. If they're pulling security, if they're having to make perception checks, or fast talk a guard, or fight somebody off who's trying to prevent the whole thing from happening. That's the way I look at it. It's an element to the game, but it doesn't have to dominate. I think when you talk about like this duet, if it becomes this thing that one player and the dungeon master are doing, and it's a yawn fest for all the other players, I don't think anybody likes that. We
No.
certainly don't want that for the game.
No. Now, since the supernatural is going to be part of it, you kind of hinted at some degree of magic when it comes to Nash, and I probably mispronounced that.
No, you did good.
Good
Naosh.
enough. Yeah.
The how do you handle it? Is it a case where magic is treated as a different type of skill?
Well, that's a great question. Like Travis said earlier, Naosh is the closest we come to class. And to expand on that a little bit, if somebody elects to have Naosh, there are a certain number of these Naoshi that you can pick, and they give you access to supernatural powers, right? You choose that more or less at character creation. We can put an asterisk there, but for our conversation right now, we'll just say you pick it at character creation. You have to spend points on it, right? And it is kind of spendy. It's expensive, but in return, hey, you've got supernatural powers. That's pretty neat. So,
And it's also worth noting, just to interject, the points that you spend to get a Naosh become available to you to purchase powers. So it's not like
Sure.
They're just gone.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, they are well spent. One Naosh is a priest, right? That sounds pretty accessible to people who might not be familiar with the other ideas. So a priest is getting his powers because a god is basically working through them, right? Like the priest prays and supernatural things happen, or divine things happen, however you want to look at it. Whereas one of the other Naoshi is called a Calcatro. And it's easy to kind of think of them as psychics. There's perhaps a little bit more nuance that we can dig into if you want, but they're using the power of their mind in order to make supernatural things happen. A Thorne, they're kind of like your mutants and superheroes, right? They just have a lot of their powers. So mechanically, you have access to powers differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the Naoshi can access the same powers. Nothing is off the table, right? If you're a Calcatro and you want to get the power armor so that you're harder to hit, you can certainly do that. But the priest can too, right? There's not a spell list as we might be familiar with in Dungeons and Dragons, or put more to the point, there's one spell list and everybody shares it. Now, how that manifests narratively, we leave that open in a lot of ways, right? The game encourages people to really lean into the idea of the storytelling aspect of it. There's ideas in there, there's some structure, but if you want to be a priest and write out what kind of divine energy flows through you and under what circumstances, there's the freedom to do that. If you want to play a Calcatro and talk about how your character became a Calcatro as opposed to anybody else and how your powers work for you, that's okay. We want people to do that. You can read what the lore says in the book, and if that grabs you, that's fine. But really, I can make the case that no two Calcatro are exactly alike. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I would say so. And
Yeah. Well, just to add one thing, right? So that, as Seth, was really good to point out, right? We have essentially one spell list that's available to anybody who has an Naosh. The biggest difference is that the various Naoshi, whichever one you have, kind of determines mechanically how that power will function. And so, his example of a Calcatro having armor, right? So from a mechanical perspective, there's different manifestation time, like the power rating maximums are different, whether or not you have to roll. There's a whole bunch of different mechanics of how the characters use their power within the structure of the game, but they all have access to the same power. And so it really does allow you to craft really interesting and unique characters, because of the way that you can kind of manipulate that. And that's fundamentally one of the core elements. You know, there's kind of 2 or 3 core elements, one of which is everything is quantifiable, everything's got a rating. The other is that everything in the game is manipulable. You can change the way that the rules work for any given power or any given talent or whatever for a price. And there's a way that you can change those so that it fits exactly what you want it to be, mechanically and narratively.
Yeah, I can get that. Now, given that you have a talent system of sorts, would talents be the equivalent of skills in other games, or?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right, I can get that. What would be some of the things that would be different from the way you have talents versus the way skills work in a lot of games within the
Well, I think the
space?
sub skill and mastery system really gets to that, right? Fundamentally, you're saying, okay, I've got the ability to do X, Y, or Z, right? Like all the usual suspects are in that lineup: athletics and stealth and picking locks and picking pockets, and there's a list of I don't know 20 talents or so, whatever it is. But the ability to say, okay, I have archaic weapons, right? Well, what is an archaic weapon? You got axes, you got swords, you got maces, you got just this whole bevy of things, right? Like, if you want to really look into the history of archaic weapons, we've made a lot. So sub skill lets you kind of narrow that focus a little bit and say, okay, I want to be good at swords. And then with mastery, you can say, well, I'm really good with the long sword or the katana, So maybe you're not as good with the rapier now, but man, with that katana, you're going to be aces with it. And then mechanically, again, there's a dice roll involved, right? The higher your rating and the higher your related attributes are, then the more likely you are to be successful.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is that a good comparison is Dungeons and Dragons, because that's kind of, everybody's familiar with it. But in the current system, you have this clear demarcation between skills and actions, right? Within within combat, right? Just even on the character sheet, you've got your skills or skills and proficiencies, and then you've got your actions, right? And so your actions are swing your longsword. Well, in Altered World, swinging that longsword is a talent action roll, because it depends on how good you are with that sword. And then, even to the point of, if you're casting a spell and it's got an attack roll, you're making an attack roll that's basically has nothing to do with, or very little to do with, how good of a wizard you are, right? In Altered World, there's a power action roll for many of these rolls, and one of our Neashi is mage, right? And they use their powers in a very certain specific way, but mechanically, what they do when they cast a power, and priests do the same thing, is they make a talent action roll with their magic theory talent, or for priests, it's their religion talent. And so the talents you choose really have a much more far-reaching impact, I think, than they do in some of the other systems, where, like, by and large, if you're in combat, you're not using your talents, unless you're doing something kind of wonky that's a little outside the box. With us, like, everything's a talent. If it's not a power, it's a talent.
Yeah. I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, when it comes to powers, since it is operating on different costs, and is it going to be a case where the powers are fire and forget, or can the effects of powers be modified depending on how one constructs their character?
Absolutely, things can be modified.
Yeah, for sure.
So each power has a power cost. Some of them are quite expensive because they're very powerful, and some of them are a little bit more affordable for the point cost. And there's a lot of ways to make them more and less expensive. If you just an out of the box power, like let's take a real easy one, energy attack, right? Like it does what it says it does. You manifest some energy and use it to hurt people. That power has I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's an 8-point power cost. Which is, I mean, that's an expensive investment just to have access to it. And then, of course, once you have it, then you need to put points into its rating. But out of the box, there's no limit, right? Like every spell is a cantrip in that sense. If you compare it to Dungeons and Dragons 5th Edition, where your casters pretty much have access to their cantrips all the time. Now, if you want to make that power cheaper, you can start putting limitations on it. Like maybe you can only do it 3 times a day. Well, all right, that might make it a lot more affordable for you. Or maybe you have to do something in particular. Like if you think about Popeye getting strong, right? Popeye has to eat a can of spinach. Mm-hmm. There might be requirements that you as the player can bake into your character to adjust the cost of things and how it works. The skeleton is there. The rules spell out how to do all this and give you a few ideas from which to depart. But we want to leave a lot of room for creativity to players so that they can they can take the idea that they have for their character and work towards that as much as possible in a point-based system, right? Knowing that sometimes you just can't afford everything that you really wanted. Sometimes that's a hard stop. Sometimes it's like, okay, we'll just work towards it. As the character advances, maybe he'll get there.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, when it comes to combat, I think the big thing that I'd want to ask and in order to nail down is the way the action economy works. Is it a case where you have different types of actions throughout? Is it a case where you have an action point system? Is it somewhere in between? Where are you guys heading?
So there's 2 different pieces of this when you start comparing it to systems that people are familiar with, like D&D. So one is there's the type of action, right? And with us, the type of action both of them have to do with timekeeping. So just kind of back up 1/2 step. Mm-hmm. D&D that most people are familiar with, a turn represents 6 seconds of game time. In our timekeeping system for combat, the equivalent of a turn, we call it a phase, represents a single second of game time. And so actions get classified based on how many seconds it takes to perform that action. You have there's a menial, which is a 1-second action. There's easy, which is 2 seconds. Hard, which is 3 seconds, and complex, which is 4 seconds. And 4 seconds comprises a round, right? So we have phases and rounds. Officially, nothing is harder than a complex act, or takes longer than a complex action. Within that, you've got a little bit of kind of a split in terms of what we call there are some types of actions where it's the action occurs in the phase that you declare that you're doing it, and then you have this kind of refractory period after where you're recovering from it, and then you have other actions where the action occurs at the end of the phase cost. So a good example of this is you have a full strike, right, with a weapon, is an easy action. So it occurs in the round that you declare you're hitting somebody, and then you have this secondary second of reacting back and recovering from the hit. Whereas if a mage casts a spell, that's a hard action, and so you wait 3 seconds or 3 phases, and then in the 3rd phase that spell manifests. So that's one side of the action economy. The other is with regards to timekeeping. And it's that and this is something we've Seth and I've had some really interesting conversations, because one of the things that we realized is that this game, when this game was written, no one used battle maps. Mm-hmm. The only time you saw people pull miniatures out was in tournament play at cons. right? And so everything was theater of the mind. And so what we have a real obligation to players to do is to take these existing combat rules and figure out how do they work and what needs to be tweaked so that players can play the way they're used to using a battle map or a VTT, because we know how prevalent those are. And so we started looking at, movement versus action compared to what everybody's going to be used to with D&D. And the standard is most characters in D&D can move 25 or 30 feet, excuse me, and then take generally a single attack, or as they advance in levels, they may be able to take 2 or 3 attacks over the course of their action and their bonus action. In Altered World, one, you have the option to purchase the ability to do extra actions every round, but then you also have this, because the time scale is condensed, what you end up with is the action economy in combat strongly favors attacks over movement. That you're, if you were to say, okay, we're going to look at 6 phases of combat from in an Altered World thing, and then compare that to a single 6-second round or turn, in D&D, what you'll see is the average human over those 6 phases will be able to walk 18 feet, which is going to probably translate, and depending on how we do it, it's probably going to translate to a total of about 6 squares. So your movement gets much condensed. Now you can go faster than that, but if you do that, it becomes harder you incur penalties to your actions, because walking, we call it walking, but it's really how fast can you move without doing other things harder. But then in those same 6 seconds in D&D, you may get somebody who, even at a 20th level character, right, is going to get an attack action. And let's say, I think a 20th level fighter is going to get something like 4 attacks or something like that. And maybe they have a bonus attack if they have a second weapon. Mm-hmm. So maybe they'll be able to do 4 or 5 attacks, depending on what they're doing. In Altered World, in that same 6-second period, your average character right out of the box is going to be able to probably walk 18 feet or move 18 feet, and they will be able to make somewhere between 6 and 12 attacks over the course of those 6 phases. And so it very heavily shifts to attacks. Movement becomes less significant, and part of how we deal with that is we've included active defense options that can make it harder for you to be hit. Mm-hmm. And so if you're needing to do some positioning, you can move and then use parry or avoid or evade, and then there's differences in what they are. We have 4 of them. The 4th is block, and they mean different things, and they work a little differently each, but that allows for that if you need to do tactical positioning and you just don't necessarily have the movement to do it. Mm-hmm. You can do it. But that being said, I will also say, right, so if a normal human has a movement on average of about 3, which means they can move 3 feet per phase, so 1 square, that's at a walking pace. If all they're doing is moving, they could easily get that up to 4 or 5 squares in the course of that. Now they would be giving up their opportunity to do action. Well, they wouldn't necessarily be giving it up. They would incur significant penalties if they did so. So if positioning becomes really important in the short term, you can make it work, but it just becomes harder to do other things.
All right, I can get that. Now, I think you hinted at level beforehand. Are you guys going with a freeform XP as currency approach of advancement, or are you going with a level-based advancement?
XP is currency.
Yeah, and it's not just XP as currency for advancement. Seth hit on that.
Oh, well, XP is the currency, right? Like, you want to raise your level, it'll cost experience relative to what your current level is, right?
That's not what I meant by XP as currency. I should clarify. I'm talking about you're spending XP directly to improve attributes, skills, what have you. That is what I mean by XP as currency.
Yeah. Well, that's all part of it, right? And in addition, there's another piece. So the first piece is to improve your character. Level is one of the things you can improve. You can improve your strength, your dex, your talent, your powers under some certain circumstances, right? That you can spend XP for that, but that includes level, right? The other way level is a currency, is you can spend it at the table to alter rolls. So if you really, really want to succeed, you might want to spend some of your experience in order to have a better chance of succeeding. And that's one of the ways level is important, because the cap on how much experience you can spend on a roll is level dependent. So the higher your level is, the more likely you are to be able to spend experience to be more successful or to increase your chances of success. So that gives players this economy that they have to manage. Like, what's more important, being successful right now or holding on to this XP and spending it later so that I can raise a talent by one or 2 points and be more successful more often later.
Mm-hmm. Now, with that in mind, when it comes to the encounters, the bestiary, the things that are trying to take your life and make it unlife. Do you have plans on putting in some suggestions to modify some of their setups to account for like variations of a given species, encounter, what have you?
Sure. I mean, the nice thing about the bestiary is they're created with character creation points, right? So if you're a game master and you want to throw a significant challenge at the players, you can say, all right, all my players are 15 CCP characters, well, I'll make a 10 CCP critter, and the players have to deal with that, right? Or, if you've got 3, 4, 5 players at your table, well, they have a lot of CCPs amongst them, so you can maybe throw a 20, 22 CCP critter at them. Now, that's if you want to get creative and kind of homebrew your own bad guys, so to speak. That can be an NPC, it can be a monster, however you want to slice it. We'll also have, the manual has different entries into the bestiary, and that is also modifiable, right? Like, again, you just slap a couple of extra character creation points on it if you need it to be more challenging, or subtract some of its ratings if you feel like it's a little bit too challenging for where your players are at. It's inherently customizable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think another thing that's
pretty modular and easy to do, I think.
Yeah, I think the other thing with regards to the bestiary, right, that is worth noting, is that Altered World is different from, let's say, again, where people come from, D&D, that is primarily a heroes versus monsters or versus critters type of game. And this is much more like games where your adversaries are frequently going to be NPCs rather than some monster. Now, you absolutely have the ability within the game world Mayu to set your game up so that it's very traditional kind of sword and sorcery type play. But in the games that we played back in the day, it was predominantly character versus character, in the sense of we were facing off against NPCs that were identifiable as other people, as opposed to fighting a bunch of monsters. There were cases where there were monsters we were fighting, but it was like I said, it was primarily a character versus character type conflict.
Mm-hmm. Now, with that in mind, it sounded like you guys are planning on doing some kind of I guess I'd say a Ashcan version in the future. What would your release window be before that? Whether it's that Ashcan version or even just a quick start with a bunch of pre-gens.
Yeah. So our thought, right, is we right now where we're at is we're within the last chapter or two of revising the rules so that they are more there's some inconsistencies we're trying to revise from back in the day. We're also trying to bring it more in line with the way people play now, and kind of meet their expectations. Where 25 years of gaming history.
Mhm.
Once that's done, then we have an adventure that's already set up that we can do. We'll probably do, I think we're probably striking for somewhere between 10 and 20 pre-generated characters, one to represent each of the playable species that are in the book, and then develop the lay out the format and all that, and put together those quick crib sheet kind of things. And then that will be released as a free product. Just, hey, grab this, play it, see what you think. And that's what we call the beer and pretzels kit. And the idea is grab some beer, grab some pretzels, sit down, play the game. Where we go into a smaller version kind of really depends on how we proceed from a funding perspective. We had looked at doing a what I call Altered World Light, which is within the rule set, there's two different kinds of character creation. So you have character modeling and full creation. So we would, for Altered World Light, it would have just the character modeling rule set for character creation. It would have a limited subsection of the game world may use. So it's the predominant, most people end up playing, at least at first, in the major metropolitan center of the world, was a city called New Tech. So we would give you the information about New Tech, we'd give you character modeling, allow you to create your own characters, and then give you all the rules that you need. And then that would be a product that we would put together. We originally started thinking about that in the concept of, if we do a Kickstarter for the full version of the book, and the idea would be, if you pledge at a certain amount or higher, and the Kickstarter is funded, you would immediately get the Altered World Light. So you could get some of the rules just right away, right? As soon as it gets funded, there'd be a bunch of mass emails going out to send people a download link for this product. So that because we're super leery about the idea of asking people for money and then, or companies asking for money and then turning around and the product never happens. So we wanted, at a minimum, to be able to say, here's a game, right? That is absolutely playable. And then the final version would be the full Altered World. I guess technically it would be version 2.0, but a full kind of production release. And really, fundamentally, that timeline is really driven by funding, because it's driven by artwork. The sad truth is we have a fully illustrated book, and all of that artwork, just a lot of it is just simply phenomenal. It's all done, or almost all done, if nothing else, by a single artist. And those images were scanned on an absolutely state-of-the-art 1996 scanner at 72 dots per inch.
Mhm.
And so it is absolutely unprintable. And so I from a quality perspective, I would be uncomfortable asking people to buy something that looks the way it looks when it's printed out. It's just not good. And so the other side of that is that while the originals exist, none of them were archived, because when the project fell apart, nobody had the idea that it was actually going to eventually come into fruition. And so what we're looking at is we're working with artists that have the right aesthetic in their hand, and we've on our Instagram, the reality is it's super contentious. We understand, and we feel we're torn about it, but we've got some selection of AI generated art where we have artwork that is driven by an artist, which is all driven by when we could afford it and could find somebody. That's all called out, and we're working with a handful of artists to try and get that. But realistically, you're talking about, it's a 250 to 300 page book. There's almost every single page has at least one illustration on it. And so there is when you start talking about, I need 200 to 300 illustrations, you're quickly talking $25,000 to $30,000. And so that becomes really like us figuring out how that's going to work. And so time scale, like I said, we were aiming for October for the beer and pretzels kit. I think we can reasonably say we'll have it out before the end of the year because of where we're at. It's really just a matter of how quickly can we finalize our edits and how quickly can we work through formatting so that it looks nice. And then beyond that, I think the work that we're doing for the beer and pretzels kit is about 75% of the work that needs to be done for on the editing side for the Altered World Lite. And so again, that just gets into build a format, have it printed, or have it made as a PDF. I think realistically that could probably be out by summer of next year. And then from Altered World Lite, again, it's not much of a leap to the full version, except for the artwork. That it really is, we've got to figure out how we're going to do, whether it's investors or crowdfunding or whatever, how are we going to pay artists to produce the artwork that we need of the quality that we need. And so that's kind of where we're at with that. I would expect, probably best case scenario would be we really, really, really want the game to be released in 2025 in some format, right? In the official, like full, more than just beer and pretzels kit. And part of that is because the timeline of the lore starts in 2025. And so we don't want to make further adjustments beyond that. So
yeah, I can certainly get that. Well, with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you guys for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And go ahead.
Thanks for bringing us on, man. It's great to have this conversation with you. Thanks for taking the time to look at our game and ask really insightful questions. Like, I can tell you took some time to read through it, and that's just really great. Really, really glad to be here.
Oh, yeah. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody!
Sure.